Good evening to you all. My name's Ivan Gaskell. I'm Professor of Cultural History here at Bard Graduate Centre, and it's my pleasure not only to welcome you on behalf of our director, Susan Weber, but to introduce the cast of characters in this evening's discussion. This very exciting evening, at least I'm very excited by the prospect of this. It's wonderful to have such a terrific gathering to welcome our guests. I'm fortunate enough to be responsible for programming the event series titled Indigenous Arts in Transition in collaboration with my wonderful faculty colleague, Professor of Cultural Anthropology, Aaron Glass. So this introduction, yes, a round of applause for Aaron. So this introduction is properly a joint one from both of us, even though it's only me who's speaking. We both wish to remind everyone gathered that all of us speak as guests in the ancestral homeland of the Lene Lenape people, and regardless of title deeds, Manahata remains native land. Professor Glass and I felt that the completion of the refurbishment of the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art would be the perfect occasion to discuss with some of the changes and opportunities for museums in presenting the arts and cultures of the Pacific. The United States has a long history of colonial involvement with Oceania. It's produced romanticized visions of island life on the one hand, and recollections of campaigns during the Second World War on the other. Nonetheless, Oceania remains largely a mystery to most Americans. We hope to contribute to overcoming the persistence of stereotypes, to confronting the consequences of past and present colonialism, and to addressing the resilience of oceanic identities in what Tongan scholar Epeli Hau called our Sea of Islands. Our guest scholars will make remarks, which we've called provocations, that take the new gallery display as a starting point. The panelists will raise issues about art and architecture and discuss the rich conceptual values that inform the distinctive and very varied material culture of at least some of the many indigenous Pacific Island communities. Our moderator is none other than the scholar responsible for the reinstallation of the Oceanic collections in the Rockefeller Wing, Maia Nuku. Dr. Nuku is the Evelyn A. Hall and John A. Friede Curator for Oceanic Art in the Metropolitan Museum. She was born in London, and her whakapapa is both English and Maori, that is, genealogy. She, following the completion of her doctoral dissertation, she held 2 successive postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Cambridge, researching oceanic art collections alongside Pacific artists and practitioners. At the Metropolitan Museum, Dr. Nuku has developed a curatorial approach that centers Indigenous Pacific cosmological perspectives. Her exhibition, created for the Metropolitan Museum, The Shape of Time, Art and Ancestors of Oceania, terrific exhibition, travelled to Shanghai and Doha in 2023-24. Her approach to the reinstallation of the Oceania galleries at the Metropolitan Museum has been to demonstrate the creativity of Indigenous Pacific artists from the 18th century to the present through the lenses of global history, Indigenous storytelling, and Pacific oratory and performance. Albert Refiti is professor at the Auckland University of Technology, and I'm delighted to say is a visiting fellow here at Bard Graduate Centre this semester. Hailing from Samoa, Professor Refiti practiced architecture in London and Auckland before joining the Auckland University of Technology in 2002. His research centres on oceanic conceptions of space and time. While here at Bard Graduate Centre, he's completing a book titled Cosmogonic Artifacts, Spatial Exposition of Pacific Architecture. His research aims to establish a genealogy of Moana Nui and Oceanic buildings, distilling their shared ancestry of building designs and artisanal practices. These built forms are contributing to contemporary renaissances in indigenous architecture in the region. Professor Refiti is the co-editor of the Handbook of Contemporary Indigenous Architecture from 2018, Pacific Spaces, Translations and Transmutations from 2022, and the forthcoming book, The Concept of Val, Relationality, Time and Space in the Pacific and Beyond. Fred Myers is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at New York University. He's a sociocultural anthropologist who's been doing research with Pintupi-speaking Indigenous people in Australia since 1973 on their relationships to land, structures of sociality, and their art and its circulation. He's written 3 monographs: Pintupi Country, Pintupi Self, Sentiment, Place and Politics Among Western Desert Aborigines from 1986, Painting Culture, The Making of an Aboriginal High Art from 2002, and 6 paintings from Papunya, A Conversation with Terry Smith in 2024. He's edited or co-edited several volumes that explore crucial fields of cultural production, most recently The Australian Art Field, Practices, Policies, Institutions from 2020. Professor Myers has received grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies, among others. Healoha Johnston is an art historian who lives in Kaiwiki on the island of Hawaii. She's director of cultural resources and curator for Hawaii and Pacific arts and culture at the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum in Honolulu. Her exhibitions and research projects explore connections between historic visual culture and contemporary art, with a particular focus on socio-political underpinnings that inform those relationships. She's served as chief curator and curator of the arts of Hawaii, Oceania, Africa, and the Americas at the Honolulu Museum of Art. She's also worked in contemporary art galleries and in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Pacific National Monument Program, as well as more recently at the Smithsonian Institution as part of the American Women's History Initiative and Asian Pacific American Center, before joining the Bishop Museum. So with that, I'm just going to hand over the microphone, the podium, and everything else to Maia Nuku. Please welcome.
Thank you for that lovely, warm welcome. And it's really lovely to see friends and colleagues and supporters here this evening as we embark on our conversation with our wonderful panel. So I wanted to just give a little overview, in a sense, of the project that we've just unveiled in May of this year over the park at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing. And the panel tonight will conceive of us sharing projects and thinking through together some of the challenges and opportunities for exhibiting Oceania, and wrangle with the complexity of our various disciplinary efforts and endeavours to present art, life, the ideas and philosophies of this region, itself a construct that we're referring to here this evening as Oceania, but of course is referred to by a plethora of names depending on where you are located in the world, and depending on who and what your immediate and more distant and ancestral relationships may be. The Pacific, Moana Nui, Solwara, Country. You'll likely hear a variety of naming devices as we move through our discussion this evening and consider some of the strategies at play when we work within the conventions of museums, galleries, and indeed virtual spaces to produce exhibitions about, within, and across Oceania. And we respectfully acknowledge this place, the site where we gather this evening, as Lenape Hoking, the ancestral homelands of the Lenni Lenape, and pay our respects to their pathways of knowledge and life, here, now, and into the future, recognizing that New York City is a past, current, and future home for many Indigenous peoples. So I thought I'd begin by sharing a handful of ideas, aims and objectives, preoccupations that informed the redesign of the Oceania galleries, which we began about a decade ago. And then we'll proceed down the line with each of the panelists up here who will also share a project and ideas and make a statement or a provocation that will lead to some more dialogue and discussion. The complete overhaul and reconstruction of the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing has, of course, been a remarkable opportunity to reframe the galleries conceptually after the 40 years of its existence since its own inauguration back in 1982 when it was built. From the outset, I was keen to take the kaleidoscope of cultures represented in the collection housed at the Met and create a series of galleries that would really emphasize connectivity, that would foreground some of the distinct ways that communities across the Pacific think about their own relationships with space, with time, with land, water, and the elements, and indeed in terms of reciprocal relationships that are in constant flux, they are dynamic, not static, that ensure one is in steady and repeated dialogue with ancestors, with one's other than human relations, throughout the course of an event, a lifetime, a particular season, or a stage of life. It is these very relationships that are often expressed in the tangible art forms that we see in galleries and museums. The material remnants of items made and worn and danced or used that can affect change and ensure specific outcomes. I wanted to elevate these tangible material expressions of these moments, that is the art in the collection, and I use inverted commas here because we will likely get into a discussion, I'm sure, about the extreme shortcomings of that word, those three letters, art, which can never encapsulate what we are dealing with in its expansiveness and plenitude. And I wanted to figure out ways that we might layer in an expression of equally critical art forms, such as storytelling, oratory, performance, gesture, that sensorial repertoire that is often, as we know, so missing and absent from galleries where we display artworks. In these galleries that present things made and produced by artists, even that term, we have to expand that out to include practitioners, ritual experts, orators, statesmen, stateswomen, carvers, painters, weavers, photographers. The artworks that we display in the Rockefeller Wing have made art over the course of the past 500 years, things that are at once thick with history and narratives and agency, and at the same time are ongoing manifestations of agency now. So there are some of the things that were in mind when we set out to reconceive what we might present in the new space for Oceania. And if I just talk quickly through some of the slides, we did gather on the morning, if I take us back to Thursday, May 29th of this year at 5 a.m. in the morning to gather with our visiting delegations from across the Pacific and with our invited guests and the Met director and leadership and trustees of the museum to enact customary protocols appropriate to the unveiling and inauguration of these galleries. So here we are in the Great Hall. It was raining that morning, so we actually gathered everyone and brought them into the space, then proceeded to invite the Seneca Nation representatives, Peter Jemison of the Heron Clan, Seneca Nation, and Jamie Jacobs of Turtle Clan, Tonawanda Seneca Nation, and their families. This was an important moment for the museum to step back and defer authority to a community from these lands to welcome on the museum's behalf the many visiting delegations that had come from across the region. So we had about 70 to 100, I would say, guests that we were hosting, and many of these were co-host people that we had collaborated with over the course of the project to renovate. And I want to shout out Dr. Sylvia Coburn, who's here in the audience with me, who was really key in managing the arrival and hosting of these people. It was a very complex lift for us as we were moving to, crescendoing to the reopening. Sylvia is Senior Research Associate in the Department for Oceania, and so she managed a lot of the hosting, which is such a critical element of what we were actually doing in that moment. And so having to maneuver through the systems of the institution to allow for us to host in the way that we knew was appropriate was a really critical part of what we were doing that morning and in the run-up. The invitation to the Seneca Nation was really a personal one that we made to Peter Jemison. Peter Jemison actually had been at the opening of a significant exhibition, Te Māori, which had opened in our wing in 1984. So he had a personal link to many of the delegations that had come from overseas to join us. And so we wanted to make that lift through time, in a sense, to kind of pull that lineage of his visit and then reenact that, over 40 years later that morning. On the right-hand side, you'll see Che Wilson, who was head lead for our rangatira Ropu, who were visiting from Aotearoa, New Zealand. You'll see to the left of that image, Marcus Marzin, Kamalu Dupreez, who were representing the Hawaii communities. Also, they are curators and head up the cultural collections at the Bishop Museum in Hawaii. We have Katerina Iwa to the far right of that image, who is the audio narrator of our audio guide, so had been very involved in animating the galleries with Pacific Voices as part of that project. I mention her because Healoha will talk about the projects that Katerina does a little bit later. So really that was a network of people that we had worked with across the course of this opening and re-envisioning of this wing. And so we wanted them all there with us as we, created these cross lines across the Great Hall that morning and kind of leveraged those lineages and histories into the present day. Here is Marcus Mazin leading their delegations. Once we moved from the Great Hall, we moved through the medieval galleries and on into the threshold of the new galleries for Oceania. Every community that was represented in that network were offering up their chants, karakia, incantations, anything that was appropriate for them. We had several meetings before, so that group had really come together in a wonderful way in the few days before we actually met that morning at 5 a.m. And having moved to the galleries and really kind of animated the space, we gathered a wonderful photograph of us all gathered under the Quoma ceremonial house ceiling. So this was the first time we actually inaugurate the space with people. The wonderful thing was that we were able to host descendants of some of the original artists who created panels or pangal for our Quoma ceremonial house ceiling. So you'll see Toby Murungai with Matthew Kwarinch, with Shivalin Burgos, who was the artist who did the outreach and consultation for the Quoma ceiling. So this ceiling is now reorganized according to clan groups, following a consultation that she oversaw with the community in Mariwai village up in the Washcook Hills of the Sepik River. And so that was another way that we were pulling through that line from the past into the present. They feature on the audio guide, but also in the digital kiosk that's actually sited under the ceiling. So this is another strategy, really curatorial strategy, that we have layered into the gallery in terms of having people understand the historical pathways of these artworks into the collection and the people behind those they're named artists. This was a commission from 1971 by the first curator, Douglas Newton of our wing. And so it was important for us to be able to speak with the present day descendants and ask for their input into how we would reconfigure this installation, which is such an iconic one for the Met, in the new space for Oceania. So that was a special moment that they were able to actually join us and represent their community. So that's really a key part of what we've been trying to do in the Met for these collections, is really think about how we share that living dynamic. Another important project or series of projects has been to bring contemporary art into the space. And so we had rather a historic collection, in fact, of Aboriginal art. And in our research and planning for the galleries, we wanted to have a series of a space where we could showcase rotations and keep quite agile about that, but really show different aspects of the contemporary art practice that is really flourishing and thriving in the continent of Australia. And so we feature first the marvellous eucalyptus bark paintings by Nonggurnia Marawili from Arnhem Land in the top Northern Territories of Australia. And this was a special moment because we were able to welcome into the galleries and host that morning a Yolngu delegation of her relations, who also came to acknowledge her and her work as we inaugurated and unveiled the galleries that morning. Nonggurnia's work is particularly wonderful because she works with her practice is really drawn from 60,000 years of unbroken Indigenous knowledge and pathways, but she actually expresses that in some very contemporary materials. So whilst the designs and the narratives and the stories really reach back through time, she is here, you can see on the left, this wonderful, the magenta and the hot pink colours, because they are pigments taken from the magenta inkjet printer discarded cartridges in the print workshop that sits to the right hand side of the courtyard where she paints every day. And so you'll see that kind of collapsing of time in the sense that she's working in a very customary practice, but pulling in new and innovative ways, as indeed communities have always done in the region. And so just briefly to touch on another couple of things that were foremost in my mind, thinking through opportunities in this new redesign. Another was thinking about materiality, and really this unique materiality that the collection has. I've talked about the eucalyptus bark, the Cuoma ceiling. Those panels are made from sago palm panels, the petioles or pangal. And so it really feels like an opportunity to really celebrate the uniqueness, the distinctive materials that this collection is made of. So we have an opportunity there to really think about seasonality and the ephemerality of some of these materials. A lot of these things were not intended to last forever. In fact, they were intended to, mark seasonal time, to be performed, to be danced, and then perhaps to be left discarded, and all the energy of that gathering to find its way back into the soil to nurture and nourish the next cycle of the sago palm crop, for example. You see that in a lot of different materials and a lot of different masking traditions or funerary practices throughout the Pacific, and indeed we showcase that in the galleries. So we wanted to be able to present yam story or sago story. Those materials are very intentional selections by artists, usually because they have a direct genealogical line to those ancestral plants or species. So this network of kind of other than human relationships, that holistic understanding of the universe, in fact, that it's not siphoning off humans from vegetable, mineral, or animal, and so, or birds indeed. So important to think through ways that we could have these indigenous epistemologies actually kind of take root and land in the galleries and flourish. And one of the ways we did that was in not just the audio guide, where we invited our collaborators and interlocutors to share stories relating to materials so that they could actually move us through those histories and connections. but was also to try to layer that in through our labels and our content. So this is one of my favorite labels, actually. We were able to cite the words of Elder Eugene Nechero, Kanala, New Caledonia Kanak chief, who works with the Kanak scholar, who is our colleague, Emmanuel Cazereru, who is actually the Kanak director of the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, and asked permission to quote his words that I came from the taro and the yam. My father and my mother ate yam, and I am born of the sap of the yam. That starts to get people closer, I think, to understanding these tight, close relationships. And you'll have read that story about the elders, the first generation that actually come in their canoes to land on the shores of these islands are in fact yams. And so the story of the yams actually washing the salty water off their skin actually relates to the hierarchy of the chiefs that still exist in those lineages in New Caledonia. So very important stories that we wanted to layer in a kind of more direct way. And then finally, how to complicate that linear notion of space-time. So with the digital map that we were asked to have at the entrance to the gallery, so each of the 3 collections in the wing has a digital map, we kind of raised the issue that this was problematic, a kind of a cartography that wants to foreground kind of land masses. We needed, of course, to help people understand where in the world we are and how people move through and settle this vast region of the world that takes up almost 1/3 of the globe. But we wanted to also puncture that European cartography and invited an artist, Sean Connolly, to adapt a project that he had done, Spheric Oceania, to create a kind of an opportunity where we could sensitize the visitors to ideas about horizon lines and spheres and the canopy of the sky. And so you'll see that at the entrance to the wing as you move through. Hopefully you've taken that on board, and so people are kind of sensitized to a different way of thinking and indeed feeling. So I'll leave it there as we move to the panel. I think that's an important thing for me, that I really wanted people to feel something a bit different when they went in to that space. And ultimately, so just my last point on this, I hope the galleries help give that sense of kind of awareness, a new kind of awareness, that there are ways to live beyond that which many are familiar with, and that perhaps give people the sense that we might, there's an opportunity to move on from a reliance on homogeneity, this uniform set of social structures and institutions within a dominant narrative, towards a kind of pluriverse, where a world where many worlds fit, that emphasizes diversity yet interconnectedness, where we can approach the world as a multiplicity of coexisting realities, cultures, and worldviews, and reject, if we like, single world narratives, where we might encourage people to understand their role as a more relational one, which comes with responsibilities and obligations. And all this is incredibly complex, and we would suggest necessarily so, because this is the world we live in. But the exhibitions, the galleries, some of the projects you'll hear of in a moment can be a first step inside that world, giving people a glimpse of other potentialities. Even an introductory nudge towards that reflection can be a worthy endeavour, especially in these very volatile and conflicting times. So with that, I'd like to invite the panelists up, and we'll move into their presentations. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maia. It was quite a moment for the opening. Privilege to be there, especially meeting Peter Jemison from the elder from the Seneca Nation, who gave the story that when the Māori contingent in 1984, the Te Māori exhibition opening, they brought a mouldy stone which was buried in a tree behind the museum, and we're still trying to. I'm not too sure if you were part of that conversation, but it's, yeah, really interesting moment. Anyway, provocations. I begin by revisiting the notion of the museum as a institution of modernity. We all know that it is dealing with the delaying of time and space and the multitude and things that rattle in it. I returned to just this morning. I was trying to think through how to frame this talk, or my provocation, to Michel Foucault's celebrated 1967 essay on the character and nature of contemporary spaces, in the essay title of Other Spaces, which as someone who works in architecture, was quite an important one. In the essay, he never really talked about museum and art galleries, but he does introduce the idea of external space or heterogeneous space, which I reckon is an excellent way to provoke in our discussion of what and how to exhibit Oceania. In the essay, Foucault writes, this is to quote him, and I think I have the quote here: "We do not live in a kind of void inside of which we could place individuals and things. We do not live inside a void that could be colored with diverse shades of light. We live inside a set of relations," relations being the important one there, "that delineate sites which are irreducible to one another and absolutely not superimposable on one another. Sites that have the curious property of being in relation with all the other sites, but in such a way as to suspect, neutralize, or invert the set of relations that they happen to designate, mirror, or reflect. These sites that are internal to the museum are counter sites, effectively enacted utopias, in which all other real sites within the culture are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. And in Michel Foucault's view, a kind of mirror where I discover my absence from the place where I am, since I see myself over there, away from me. Museum and gallery spaces are full of tensions in this sense, spaces of estrangement and encounter, in which the Moana Nui notion of va, this is in Western Polynesia, or wa in Eastern Polynesia, serves as its correlate. Samoan artist and theatre director Lemi Bonifacio says va is a charge space that is in a continual state of whirling motion that connects the person, the viewer, to an extensive environment in which the past and present converge. If one were to stand in the center of this va, one would be torn apart, or in the case of museums and art galleries, you are taken. So here are some examples of maybe a way to think through this character of this world that one enters. Traditionally, we enter the world and we become the viewer, the subject who views and objectify the things that are there. And the example I have here is a carved meeting house in the Auckland Museum, which occupies the heart of the museum. And in this house, for those who have been to a wharenui, there are spaces that you have to pass through before you're engaged with the interiority of the house. And in the house, you have the some of the ancestors up on the wall, carved on the walls, and you have some ancestors carved on the back, and the ridge beam, an important component. In the carved houses, there is a technique that the carvers use to manipulate the sense of time, and that the rounded shoulders and even the cheeks of the carvings are slightly shaved off. It's a technique to indicate that the ancestors standing on the wall are not in the space that gathers people, but they are standing outside the space. And these are like windows. So the ancestors do the viewing, the watching, and you as a person who enters become the object of this world. So this notion of the techniques to take away that privileged position that viewers or people that enter into this world. And this is the kind of world that I like to provoke, that museums, because they carry these many ancestral worlds in them, should be the way to articulate, to make ways to take away the control, to take away the ground from those people who enter into this world. So there are a number of projects that I worked on that try to successfully, and maybe not successfully, to try to use this technique. This is an exhibition in 2007 at the Museum of Wellington in Sydney in New Zealand, and it's a collection of the Burton brothers in the 19th century. They used to take these tours of the Pacific. These photographs were taken of a tour through Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. And then they returned back to New Zealand. And there's a photographs of, what happens in the tour. So I designed the spaces to encapsulate the photographs. And one of the techniques was to use the armature or the vitrines or the way the hanging of the works as standing away from the walls. The floors are painted yellow, sickly yellow at that, and the floor and the walls. And the frames that hold the photographs are actually, they look like characters, like stick characters of a person serving. So in the way to frame the techniques that the space is not neutral, the photograph is not there for you to see, but there are these other figures in the space. And in one of the photographs here, one of the techniques that we used was to actually use the photographs and bend to curve them in the space so that the surface of the photograph, acknowledging the photograph, is a construct that can be curved, and there's something else taking place in this kind of world. Another one that I worked on earlier this year, 2025, in the Sharjah Biennial in the United Arab Emirates. These are some of the works that I did myself, a very small drawings in a journal like that. And I was approached to take these works, which are about gatherings. So every gatherings that I attend, I map them, I locate where people are. Usually also when you have a Ava ceremony, which are located. So I was given the opportunity to take these drawings and exhibit them, and to take them out of their context into a completely foreign world. It is completely separate sets of rituals that happens in that part of the world. So I wanted to, again, deal with this idea of making the space something other than the world that we're familiar with. And these examples of spaces that already embody these kind of characteristic in the oceanic world, that characteristic that the environment is bigger than the person. An exhibition I have to design to illustrate the attempt to design spaces that incorporate the idea of estrangement and to extend Foucault's notion of other spaces towards what here I was dealing with this notion of the strange and the eerie, an idea that incorporate notions from Freud's idea of the unhomely, and of course the museum being very much that kind of space. And just to give you some idea of the space that these drawings were housed in, again, this idea of the sickly yellow ground, the walls, the ceiling, and even the lighting, so that you walk in this other world, bathe in this kind of rather strange. So bear with me. One other exhibition that I worked in 2022, which was I curated this exhibition and had a hand in the design of the spaces again. This idea of the amateur holding the work, insisting that they are more than just a neutral background. And again, the figure of, in this particular exhibition, the roots and routes, it uses the stick chart of Melanesian stick chart as a kind of a coding to build this armature. And that is from me. Thank you.
We'll just take a little moment there just to think through what you've just presented. I think it's wonderful. I love this idea of stripping away and taking away and having people, kind of try to decenter them and unfamiliarize them, say, and just move them into a center where a space that is not neutral, as you said. And so it's interesting you're using these the installation, the armature, as a way to kind of unsettle. So the other side of that is the unfamiliarity that I think people have with some of these. Is there a danger that the towards an othering? Then that's tricky, because in a sense we did in a way the opposite, which was to have fairly neutral. We didn't want to like white cube, so we played with the materiality to make that space warmer, but we did want it not to interfere, so the objects kind of, or the ancestral works had an opportunity to be in their own space. So there are different moments, I would suggest, where you could do these kind of strategies. What do you think?
That is true. But one of the things that I learned from Lemi Ponifasio about he's a choreographer, director of opera, was this idea that if you present works that entertain people, then people are entertained. But if you present works that unsettle people, the duration of their interest lasts a lot longer. They may want to discover online. I mean, there's so many modes of how you can find out about the work. And that's what I was thinking, that people are startled. Like great example of the theatre that Lemmy does is he would spend 20 minutes of the theatre at the beginning with very low light on the stage. And what happens is that you reach your boredom threshold 20 minutes in, and in fact, about 15 minutes in, a lot of people will get up and leave the theatre. But those people who remain would then the work start to open, and this other world that is brought to bear, and usually ancestral kind of ideas about from the Pacific and from South America. And this is the kind of thing that I was interested in using as well, and especially, I'm a theorist as well. I mean, probably most of the time I think about ways to make new ideas. It's that, I mean, there's so much of the world that younger generation cannot understand how we function normally in the way that we make spaces, we make stories. And there is an idea from Mark Fisher that the notion of the strange and the eerie, or the liminal space, where there is, where things are no longer just real, but there may be cartoon characters, so that you enter into this other world. There's no future, there's no past, but there is this sickly world, and that's something I'm really interested in using those kind of ideas to kind of take people out into this, what I really think the notion of va is when you no longer have a ground and you're searching for what is important in the world, etc. Anyway,
Fantastic,
we'll
thank
go on
you.
forever.
So you've brought in that wonderful notion of that, the void, but the charged void. Thanks, Albert. So over to Fred Myers, who'll now present his thing.
Okay, well, I'm not a curator. I help curators, but I'm more of a writer, an ethnographer. I want to raise some issues involved in the exhibition of Indigenous Australian art that might fit in the notion of the Pacific rather than Oceania, because it's the desert where I'm working. The particular case is a Pauahi Tula artist. This is a slide of from 2010 of a group of Pintupi women dancing outside of Pauahi Tula Artists in the Todd Mall in Alice Springs, which is where their business is centered, but that's not where they're from. The Pauahi Tula Artists is indigenously owned cooperative that was instituted in 1971. When we're talking about transitional activities, their painting is in acrylics on two-dimensional surfaces. It's an invention, a new form of cultural production that draws on centuries of ceremonial and other forms of decorative and engraving, body painting, markings in the sand, and so on. Pauahi Tula, there's the gallery, there it is, now you can see how it's spelled. The background is my work on an upcoming exhibition celebrating their 50th anniversary. This is the catalog. I'm really here to plug it. It's opening in the end of January. That will be held
right?
at NYU at the
Gray
Gray
Gallery.
Museum, and now called a museum. They've kind of grown up a bit. I'm interested to disturb on the one hand. The idea of disturbance really attractive to me, that I already saw that Albert was pushing there. But here it's about their too easy. The work is beautiful, aesthetically attractive, and has always gained an audience in the Western kind of art world, and even in the sort of ethnological world, for the comparable to abstract expressionism and other forms that we are familiar with. But I've always been disturbed by their too easy assimilation to these forms of Western art as the basis of their inclusion in a category of art which was already historically limited, I think. And I want to ask how the fullness of their own understandings and their work might contribute to theories of contemporary art as they're emerging. In other words, how do we put them together? As the exhibition has been intended as a celebration of 50 years of Pauahi Tula, I'm really not. We have a problem. We want to show that the art is beautiful, right? That's what draws people in. That's what makes it saleable. These are collections that are not. It's not a market enterprise, but also to draw people into the project in which Pauahi Tula has been engaged, not to just exhibit beautiful paintings or even their connection to indigenous cosmologies of country, their relationship to the landscape and people's ownership, but present the company itself as an achievement, and the paintings as a vehicle of self-determination among people who are embedded in a settler colonial society for which they don't have full control over their lives, but through their art have made engagements and interventions in the larger narratives about their placement in the world and about their rights. In achievement of land rights. This is just an example of a painting, probably one of the bigger ones, and it's being done. You see, they paint on the ground. They paint on acrylics. In this case, it's Belgian linen stretched, right? So it's really already organized with respect to a Western or a collector's art, a buyer's art market. The main artist here is on the right with the beanie on his head. This is a painting which actually includes most of the stories in his own country. And he's getting help from a son-in-law and others The figure in the middle is actually him in his ancestral mode, his conception dreaming, Tontamortu, man with short legs. And you can see that while he is the creator, he's not the executor of the entire painting, which presents a bit of a problem for collectors and the sense of artistry, but we'll just leave that for a moment. It's a huge painting. I'm the scale on this painting right here, but it's also, you can see in another sort of anniversary event, it was hung at the entry of the exhibition because of its, its power and its effectiveness. And you can see when it's laid out there, it's painted on the ground, but it's hung up there in a way that really captures your attention with a certain kind of mystery. There are some issues here. I wanted to say that the paintings, they are realizations in two-dimensional surface and acrylic paint of stories and designs and representations of landscape, but also the activities of ceremony. And the painters themselves put these elements together in their own, often individual way, sometimes arriving at templates which are shared with others. But in the early period of the work, when they were inventing this new form, there's an incredible range of variability and creativity, I would say virtuosity, in the ways in which they put these different matters together. In this case, the stories, in almost all cases, draw on the ancestral realm, Chokorpa in Pintubi and much of Central Australia, which was translated often as the dreaming, but it's sometimes said to be everywhen. It's the foundation of the world as it came to be realized in the present, and everything in this world that we have it now has its origins in that, and that's what they're painting. But what they see their paintings, and what I learned from living there, and the way they talk about them, is that these stories are owned. The people who paint them are their custodians. They have rights to represent them in ritual and song, which they inherit through kinship. But they talk about the exchange of them or their movement into the world in the same way they talk about ceremonial knowledge. They are given, Yonginpa means giving, or Yutininpa, shown to people. The word sell doesn't exist really in the language. And they are supposed to be, ceremonial production is supposed to be compensated with a ceremonial gift, usually of meat. And the people who are exposed to this new knowledge are often novices. And so in the lead up to one of the best exhibitions that I know in 2017, Bobby West Dubarula, who was a friend of mine, whose father was one of the founders of the, tried to liken the movement of these things as he said, well, we're giving them to you. It's like what we do with Punyunyu. And that's why we should be paid, right? But paying seems to commercialize this work, which flies in the face of our notions of art as somehow not really dominated by money, not dominated by the wish for money and needing some kind of authenticity. So they're always in a space of a certain kind of uncertainty, if you really want to explain it. And I think that's part of the excitement of the work that could be. This is Bobby himself doing a painting when he's making that statement. Just to show something about these paintings, this is in the late 70s. This painting was originally done in Papunya in 1975, and it was used as a land rights painting as part of the project in the Australian national space of gaining recognition for people, because these paintings are of their places, and therefore they gain attention, they gain recognition, they gain visibility. One of the things that I'm really interested in about this work is the way in which the materialization of these ideas into forms that can circulate allow them to create a space of recognition, a space of achievement, a space of producing their own identities in public, which couldn't be done with ceremony. So moving into this form with all of its contingencies has been a means of them affecting their place in the world. So I'm just going to stop there. Oh, let's see one other thing I will add to this, which is that by virtue of the fact that these paintings are done more often than ceremonial paintings were done, the artists or painters who do them achieve a certain kind of repetition of work in which they develop and extend their work. And so there is now an art history that can be done because of the way in which this work, because it's been turned into a practice that can be repeated and has its own history now that it can be explored. So, okay, I'll hold on to this yet.
So what do we do with the incommensurability of these systems that are coming into play? You know, that you're right on this border when you're with Pintupi community and your family, you know, like it's the act, you've said the act of painting, the embodiment of that knowledge in a new medium, that's critical. But now this other system has kind of said the tangible thing in front of me is what's important, and they're kind of going, not really, but in a way it is, because it's now used for land titles. So, you know, it's kind of shifting. It's just,
I see it works in several directions, I think, as a form of cultural production. Social. On the one hand, they gain resources and money that they can use to remain in their country on country and be able to transmit the knowledge, which is the basis for painting and experience of the land. One thing, so that's for their cultural future. Two, it allows people to take up an identity that's recognized in the world. I've heard the men increasingly and say now to younger people, this is the way in which people can know you. This is what you have. This is what you can use to be in the world. And I think it has a significance in terms of contemporary theories of art. It's certainly related to ideas that people have about art and the practices of visibility that engage people and draw people into public spaces and mix them together. But I think it can be used to push past ideas of only the visual dimension of these of this art is what matters.
thanks, Fred, that's amazing. And I think maybe we hold in our minds as we move now to Healoha's statement and slides, you know, what's happening in the galleries for Pintupi when those paintings are displayed. Many things are happening that people viewing, say in New York, are not seeing, but there's a lot more charged energy and connections going on. Thanks.
The question or the provocation that I was thinking through was how a curator can honor intentions. It's a lot easier when you're working with contemporary artists who can tell you, especially when they're still alive, or if they were operating in a time when museums would ask, how do you want your piece hung? How would you want this installed? Is it meant to decay naturally? Do you want us to preserve it? These kinds of questions museums ask, and you get answers to when you're working with a living artist. But Bishop Museum consists of a collection where in many cases we don't know who the maker was, or in some cases we do know who the maker was, but those kinds of questions weren't asked at the time when the pieces were acquired. We worked with a contemporary artist named Katerina Tiaiwa, and a photograph of her showed up in the front with Maia's presentation at the very beginning. Katerina is Bunaban, so her ancestors come from the island of Banaba. And this project, Banaba, is an exhibition that continues to evolve and grow based on her research. Her research centers on the way that the island of Banaba was mined in the span of 2 generations to the point of being uninhabitable. And it was mined for phosphate that was then processed into fertilizer, which was exported all around the world. And so her research, she's been mining the archives, in particular the Australian National Archive, in order to track the movement of the phosphate and therefore Banaba, the land and the people. And so when she talks about Banaba, she is talking about the land and the people. And she describes the way that, the human remains that would have been in the earth were mined and processed and shipped then in these bags. And for her, it's important to see Project Banaba go to all the places where the phosphate went. And so Hawaii was one of the places that imported Banaban phosphate. And we have records at Bishop Museum about those transactions that were occurring in the early 1900s as plantations were very, active and economically viable. And so with the artist, our exhibition team developed what you see here, which includes a series of props that are very convincing. It was hard for people to tell what was actually an archival document and what was a prop that you could touch. And, you know, again, the convention of the map, this was something that was important to Katerina to show how this place that people have in often cases like never heard of until they've stepped foot in the show, realize that Banaba touched the world. And this, what happens is, you know, she's mining the archive, but then the gallery becomes this space that as people, you know, engage with the content, the archive starts to grow. So the figure, the mannequin in this photograph is wearing a skirt. That skirt was actually made out of phosphate bags and was given to Katerina by people who had also come from Banaba. In addition to the skirt, there's jewelry and adornments, other garments. And so the archive continues to grow. And so what starts as a critique where she has, you know, blown up photographs and, you know, printed them onto textiles and fabrics and completely changed their scale, you know, the archival record, she's changed the scale, she's changed the medium in some cases. You know, it becomes a very different kind of environment where it goes from being both a center of critique to then being a space of solidarity where people are able to contribute and a space of generosity as people see the need for this archive to continue to develop. And it becomes a mobile archive in its own way. It continues to move around the world just like the phosphate did. And so you can see there's a screen here that says No More Banabans. And that was a video that she created, Katerina created by looping archival audio video footage. And it's jarring, it's absolutely jarring to sit there and listen to what then she hired a narrator to read some of the archival materials where people are being given an edict to that they are being exiled from their land, that the government, the British government is taking the land, and if they think that they can keep it, they are deluding themselves. And it's hard to sit there and listen to it and you think, oh my gosh. And then on the opposite side of the gallery, John Osorio, who is a Kanakawiwi scholar, wrote a poem and a song to Katerina's sister, Teresia Tiaiwa, who is a renowned scholar in Oceania. And, you know, so you see this duality again play out in the gallery where you've got these, you know, really oppressive and brutal records that you're hearing play. And if you step into another side of the gallery, you hear John Osorio's voice singing a song of aloha and love to Katerina's sister. This, you know, this is another exhibition that was, so the Project Banaba was co-curated. I joined as a co-curator with Yuki Kihara and Joy Inamoto. And this exhibition, Kua Lanakila, was curated by my colleague Sarah Kuaiva. And it was prompted by the need to recontextualize a koa canoe that had been on display actually at a hotel. The museum went through a period of time where, you know, it was sharing its collection and hotels had a lot of space, and a 40-foot koa canoe commissioned by Prince Kohio ended up in a hotel lobby. And as new staff members, we were hired in 2022, came to realize that this canoe needed to no longer be in a hotel, but needed to be at Bishop Museum. And so the gallery became a home for the canoe where, you know, oral histories and community building really took place. And so it became a moment for us to be able to work with the canoe communities in Hawaii and restored the canoe to the point where it could actually get back in the ocean. And so, you can see the difference here where the canoe in this case is draped in lei, and it has gone from being, in the collection, on view in a hotel, to then being in a gallery, which again became a space of community building, to then being launched in the water just this past Saturday. And, as a point of comparison here, you can see the va'a in the gallery with the lei off to the side. And then on Saturday, where it's at Ke'ehi Lagoon with a canoe carver named Uncle Bobby Puakea draping a lei over the canoe as it's about to, endeavor into the water. And so, in both of these cases, the gallery space becomes an intermediary space. It's not the culmination of something, but rather a space where people can continue to rethink the next stage. And, so for Project Banaba, you have a contemporary artist who's taking the archive into the gallery, then becomes its own type of an archive that is mobile and moving around the world. And in the case with the which is the name of the canoe, you have the community who is coming to the museum and insisting that a collection actually is not being well cared for in this case, unless the canoe gets in the water. And so, community, collection, to gallery, to the ocean, back to the museum. And so, there's this cycle that can continue to be fostered depending on how we think about the role of the gallery as either an endpoint or kind of like a point on a trajectory.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Healoha. I mean, I think maybe we should just pull that line out a bit amongst ourselves on the panel before we open up to questions. But that idea of the museum and indeed the gallery as a generative space, I mean, you've all spoken about that in a sense, that it's not the end point, the culmination, but it can be this foundation. And if we're thinking about it as an active space where we can host people, where we can work through complexities and, shift gears in that way, what might each of you think about that idea? Is it possible in a way to bring those audiences with us when we're doing that, or is it enough that we create the conditions and the opportunities for community to come and do what they need to do, or is it incumbent upon us to kind of maybe share that as a goal and ambition for our museums?
Since I'm holding the mic, I'll just start first. As a curator, usually by the time an exhibition opens, we are neck deep into the next project. We rarely get to actually just like celebrate and enjoy. We're like so exhausted by opening night, we're just trying to like get through it. And when you talk about changing the conditions, I think that's part of the change, is like recognizing that when you're moving at the pace of trust, you just can't function that way, because the minute the show opens, you've got elders who want to meet and they want to talk. And then it's like, oh, we should be doing oral histories. Why do I, as the curator, get to hear from a kupuna that everyone should get to learn from, especially if it pertains to the collection? And part of my job is making sure that knowledge transference happens, into the future. It's not just for me to hold for myself. And so, I think part of those conditions is really, recognizing that if we want the gallery to be a space that isn't an endpoint, we have to manage workloads in such a way where we value that talk story and we value the oral histories and the time. I mean, when you're talking with elders, it takes time. You got to listen, and in many cases when you're having, you're trying to get at something around a particular piece. I've done a lot of, talking with kupuna, and they describe the need to kind of clear away the cobwebs, and then they get to it. So it just takes a bit of time. And you gotta take that time, So I think that that's one of the conditions that became like I became physically aware of as we kind of moved through these different exhibitions.
Yeah, I'm just going to mention not something that I was ever able to do, but in the lead up to the exhibition, the catalog, we really one of the curators who really made Papunya Tula become visible in the world was Hetty Perkins, who's an Indigenous Australian, and she's was the curator at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And she perceived, well, she always felt that indigenously, you should be giving something back to the community that worked with you. And so they, one of the huge problems in Central Australia is kidney failure. And some of the Pinjabi and Papunya Tula people were subject to this, and they had been pressing the government for dialysis in remote communities. It was impractical, too expensive. And so Hetty and Papunya Tula, the company, and Sotheby's, the main person for Sotheby's, who was very, they put together an auction for the opening of the show. Was the beginning of the Olympic Arts Festival in Sydney, so really high visibility. And the communities painted 4 paintings, collaborative paintings. They sold them for over $1 million. People made donations who were collectors. They gave some of their best work for sale, and they raised the money to start a indigenous government organization now called the Purple House, Western Desert, dialysis. And so this is one of the things that's achieved through a kind of, say, reciprocity around it, not always inside the gallery, but through the instrumentality of the gallery and the visibility. The last photograph I had up there, which was of Patrick Oladuti, to give you an example of this, he was on dialysis, but the Western Australia government, where Kibakor is, said they would no longer pay for him to go to Alice Springs to have dialysis. He would have to go to Perth, which is 1,000 kilometers. He said, I'm not going, I'd rather die in my own country. His visibility as an artist and the support of so many well-to-do collectors and others made it impossible for the Western Australian government to withhold the care. So I think that the art world and the museum and galleries, they have a kind of instrumentality that can be mobilized to produce these kinds of results.
Okay, I mean, in New Zealand, the phenomena of what we may call Pacific art, and then I said Māori art. Pacific art started around 1986, 1987, and right from the beginning, I was there as a young student. There was always an attempt to talk to the work or the artists who were there gathered. There was always a sense that the work should be addressed. There should be, and including in that was the idea of performance. So the artist or a community of people who relate to the art of the work will do dance or poetry. So it became very much a thing that if it's a painting, a sculpture, or an installation, there's always the idea of performance that Rosanna Raymond would say activate the work. So to give agency over to the thing, and I think that is characteristic also of Māori art. Right from the beginning, the works, the artists, and the works and the tools were always addressed when there is an opening in a gallery. And longer, I mean, the convention now is to have a pōhiri at the address the people, address the work, address the occasion. So it's very much part of that world where acknowledge that people and their relations allow for the thing to be sung into the present, or to if it's something that's launched or made new, launch into the world, and to acknowledge that moment. I think those are really important things that I personally learned how Pacific and Māori's community in New Zealand, and now, I mean, widely, I'm sure, in Hawaii similarly. And that is, I mean, that is really important way to you know, to reorganize the way we think about museums and the work of museums and as a living thing. And you know, there's always now the sense that when um, certain friends who are artists and poets, when they visit a museum, they always identify an ancestor or something or a collection of things that they familiar with, and they go and they would either lay things or they would talk to the work to sing them into the present. So there's a kind of a really important uh, developments that I, you know, only for me at least, it only emerged around the 1985, 86, at least the work we're doing in New Zealand, very much part of that from that wonderful opening at the Met in 1984. And I think that's kind of made it a nationwide idea to actually address the things that on the side of the artifacts rather than people. Yeah.
So the ancestors would be happy because things aren't supposed to get stuck in that sense. So I think what we've arrived at perhaps is that, you know, that's the future of it, is that it's you know, it's the afterlives and what can be facilitated from that point onwards, which is perhaps quite unique in the way that we start to think about things. Okay, I know Andrew is probably keen to get the mic out in amongst the gathering and ask some questions of our panel. Thanks very much.
Any questions? Oh, thank you so much.
Hi. You were speaking, earlier about the idea that these objects are more than just visual objects, and you're talking about, the practice of the people who created them. When we go to Western museums, when we go to the Met, we see people. It's also a creative space for the people who visit. I go to the Met, I see people drawing, interacting with things. And how do you transfer this idea about things being more than just visual to people who are engaging in a creative practice in the museum itself? Artists, art students, that sort of thing. Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, I'll say that, the visual that's not to be diminished in it. Like, I still consider that very much a creative response and an exchange with the piece. So we often have people who will come in and we want to make space where they can sing a song to a featherwork, piece, or sit down and sketch it or brainstorm something new that they're thinking through. So I do think that sketching and responding visually is a very sincere way to experience work in the gallery. I think if you think about what Albert is saying, how, it's also drawing attention to the way that, the observer is also the subject, that the pieces around them are also alive and paying attention. And I think it's, finding a way to maybe invite people to participate. And sometimes it is like setting conditions where people think they can actually let someone know. So like with Katarina's exhibition and the photographs, the photographs were blown up so big that people could identify who was in the picture. And being that we are a museum in Hawaii where there are Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, walking through the galleries every single day, people would leave notes with the visitor services saying, I think I know who this is. And I think that's such an incredible thing that can come from a visual experience, is an identification and naming of people who are often unnamed in an archive.
Often, I think Maya showed the korma ceiling in her slides, and some of the patterns there are really interesting. I mean, they're about traps and a lot of eyes. And one of the things that you will notice in a lot of houses in the Pacific, in Oceania, symbolic elements that reference eyes, so that the houses, the spaces, where the ancestors have receded and they take up places in the interior or even in the exterior of the world, and the notion that you're always being looked at, and that I find that really fascinating. So one of the things that I always do, like the Met is a great example, is that you can count how many eyes looking at you. You know, you could do that kind of thing, and it's a really wonderful way to think that people who made these things had an intention to give intentionality or agency to the things. And I keep thinking of the chroma ceiling because I try to look up the patterns, and they were all, most of them are patterns because they're shield. They're elements for fighting and protection and armature. That they are traps for certain kind of forces. And when you have that in an interior that looks upon you and seducing you into falling into these things, because there are the multitude of them, or what I would call a proliferation of eyes, that they make for something more than, you know, it allow things to speak to you in something in you more than you. Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I think a different perspective really, but I think the positioning of works in the series on walls and the way they're put together actually should take people's attention away, not just to look at singular works, but to get some grasp on the work through looking at them in relationship to other works that might produce an idea of what lies behind them. And I think there's a tendency of people to get captivated, which is fine, of the production of a singular great masterpiece and so on. But I've heard many people say it, and there are such works. But I think that that doesn't accomplish the goal of taking of people to see what's commonly held by people, what's a real achievement of virtuosity as opposed to a common attempt, or even in some sense. So, for example, if you look at the Pintupi work and you look at the early work, by the middle of the 1980s, they've abstracted completely and they have this visual kind of op art effect. And they have gone straight to the effect of what it's like to be in a ceremony, right? Just, and that has an immediate effect. And they've drawn, they tried other ways of trying to communicate some of this, but that is a way that really drew attention and to people to a particular quality that they were trying to show.
Great. Any other questions? Oh, thank you.
First, I want to say thank you so much to you all for sharing such rich ideas and so many varied examples. I'm curious about the idea of a traveling exhibition or thinking about the location of display. So it's very different potentially to exhibit Oceania in New York and in the Pacific. So I'm interested, especially in the context of what Albert said, at the beginning about kind of jarring visitors and making them feel uncomfortable or surprised. In what ways do you consider audience, location, and site specificity in your exhibitions? And how do you think that the site determines the exhibition's appeals?
You want to go?
Well, I mentioned that she's asking, like, for example, so when we have an exhibition in Hawaii, it's very different from what happens in New York for Oceania, because we have an entire museum devoted to the content, where if people are at a different stage in their learning, it's like, yes, you can go see a map. This is where Hawaii is in the broader ocean. So we don't have that in temporary exhibitions, and we can get at some pretty meaty subjects because the expectation is that you're in Hawaii, you're engaging, and this isn't just sort of a stopover, that, you know, you're there and yeah, you know, and we also recognize that we serve the source communities also. And they deserve to have an experience too, one that isn't like, this is Hawaii, Hawaiian people are still here, etc. And so, you know, yeah, and we've been told too, that was one of the things that has come up, like if we were to ever travel our shows, that the content would have to be totally redone because of the point of entry, where it's like in Hawaii, we use Hawaiian names, Hawaiian street names, and those kinds of things would all need to be translated. You know, we don't translate like the word mele, which means song. We don't translate hula, because if you're in Hawaii, these are just words that everyone uses. That would all need to be redone. So I do think there's a lot to say about context, I think.
Uh, I think there's two kinds of legacies. One where works enter into the museum circuit in the 19th century or even before that, so that the context is completely different. And then this is where I think the work of curators, designers, and writers can address in some ways to recharge these things that have been in museum for a long time, to have another life, an afterlife. A very strange one at that, because they return at a time when communities have moved on. So that's a really interesting question there. The other one is where I think Fred is talking about, where the legacy of contemporary art market, where a lot of artists, Indigenous artists, make these works not because of their community, they're the source material, but they end up in galleries for sale at Christie's here in New York and everywhere else. So that's a different kind of legacy. And a lot of very uh, clever artists are trying to make the work speak about those kind of legacies, or speak about that disjunct between where they are, the source material they're working with, and how to try to counter these work becoming commodities, or even play on the idea of becoming a commodity. Yeah, and when it falls in the hands of curators and designers, there's an extra layer of trying also to play with the disjunct between location, spaces, times. Yeah, I mean, and I think this is where I think the wonderful inventions of curators and designers can come in terms of addressing those kind of different legacies. Yeah, I think it's a really wonderful problematics to work in for creative people, not a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, because you were talking earlier about your cosmograms when you took those to Sharjah Biennial. Can you explain a bit about how? Because then you were in your artist hat, but you curated the space in quite a specific way so that it would land, I think, with the
Yeah, I really,
international and local communities that would be seeing that.
before I even arrived in Sharjah, I had the idea of this yellow room, the sickly yellow room with these things on the wall. When I put them up the day that I installed them, I walked outside and there was a sandstorm. And guess what? It looked just like the room. Like the sun, you could barely see the sun. So that was it hit me to think, oh, maybe it's not so out of place after all. Yeah, that was something I learned really quickly. Okay, yeah, out of my control.
Did you have Carver?
Yes, and one of the things, as I mentioned before, this notion of activating the space. I now, because I lead a research center back in New Zealand, which tries to reactivate or research the notion of spatiality and performativity in art and in communities and in museums. The notion of kava or ava is really important to that. And one of the things that I took over was a kava bowl, which I sat down and had the kava ceremony with Sheikh Hor Kasami, who was the patron and the president of the Sharjah Biennial, and a number of, I think there were 4 or 5 New Yorkers there drinking kava with me. And yeah, it was a wonderful out of place experience to kind of recalibrate this kind of ideas about sociality, about art, and in different places. Yeah, it was quite a wonderful, interesting experience.
Do we have any other questions? Well, then please join me in thanking our panelists for this wonderful evening.